Hi guys, wow. So people choose, yes choose, to use food banks. That's exactly what Tory MP Johnny Mercer told Kay Burley on Tuesday. So Johnny prides himself as being some sort of crusader for military veterans, but when asked about them using charities to survive the cost of living crisis, the Conservative dismissed the idea. Johnny doesn't seem to be a member of the new Conservative group of headbangers formed to take a hardline approach to a number of issues, but that doesn't mean that he isn't a massive you-know-what. Have a listen.
Is there any need for military personnel to be using food banks? Deborah Haynes, our defence editor, carried that story last month.
Look, these are personal decisions around, how people are budgeting every month. I don't want to see anyone using food banks. Of course I don't. But we're in an extremely difficult time around the cost of living. I'll always advocate for service personnel to get paid more. I'd be mad not to. But it has to be, within the constraints of a budget. And to be fair, this Prime Minister only 2 years ago gave Defence the biggest settlement that we've seen since the end of the Cold War, actually. So, look, I think none of these things are black and white.
People don't choose to use food banks, do they?
Say again?
People don't choose to use food banks. You're saying it's a choice whether they use them or not. It's not. They're using them because they're saying they have no other alternative. Well,
in my experience, Kay, that's not correct. I think there are some dire cases that we need to do more to wrap our arms around and make sure that they're a safety net for people. I don't think food bank use is an accurate portrayal of where levels of poverty, relative or absolute poverty, are in this country. I don't want to see anybody using food banks, but, I think that being in the military still affords you a good wage and a good quality of life, and that will continue to be the case.
Okay, so military veterans are being thrown under a bus here, and active personnel are being thrown under a bus, because both of them rely on food banks. Now, military veterans, many of them can't hold down a job because of mental health issues like PTSD. They receive from working in the military, being in a war zone or whatever. But active personnel are, so a private in the British Army earns £20,400 a year. Could Johnny live on that? I don't think so. Johnny's on probably £100,000 a year. So it's easy for him to say to people on £20,000 a year, well, you just need to budget better. You don't need to go to a food bank. But he's not just talking about military personnel here, he's talking about people in general. That food bank usage is not a good barometer for poverty. Why do people use food banks? To suggest that it's a choice, people choose to, it's like saying, well, you choose to be poor. How disconnected and frankly arrogant these people are. You choose to use a food bank. Food banks exist because government has failed. I don't know how many times I have to say this. Food banks should not exist. Him saying that, well, people shouldn't really be using food banks. He would prefer them to starve. Is that it? Because it's embarrassing for his government and his party. 13 years of rot. 13 years of poverty. 13 years, well, not 13 years, but close to that of austerity, which has been imposed to drive people into poverty. That food bank usage isn't a good measure of poverty. How disconnected do you have to be? But once again, people do not choose to be poor. People do not choose to use food banks. They're desperate. And the situation is becoming more and more desperate because while inflation is expected to drop, it doesn't mean prices will drop. It will mean prices will increase at a slower rate. But if you're on over £100,000 a year or over £86,000 a year, if you're earning that amount of money, of course you're protected from the cost of living crisis. But privates in the military on £20,000 a year, more or less, and people on less than that are not, and they have to rely on food banks. My God, where did these people come from? Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.